The screech of tires and the sickening crunch of metal against wood jolted Marcus awake at 6:17 a.m. on a Tuesday. His bedroom window offered a perfect view of what used to be his prized Japanese maple and the hood of a white semi-truck now firmly embedded in his front yard. Behind the wheel sat Deborah Winters, or as the Oak Ridge Estates community had come to call her, HOA Karen. What the actual hell? Marcus muttered, fumbling for his phone to call 911 while simultaneously pulling on sweatpants. By the time he made it outside, Deborah was already marching across his lawn, clipboard in hand, somehow managing to look both flustered and indignant. "Your tree was in violation of HOA Code 7.3, she announced before Marcus could even speak. It obstructed the view at the corner and created a safety hazard. Marcus stared in disbelief. "So you drove a truck into it." "This is unfortunate timing," Deborah said, straightening her perfectly pressed blazer. "I was coming to deliver your third notice about the tree when I had to swerve to avoid a cat." She glanced at the wreckage with pursed lips. "Though this does resolve the violation." The absurdity of the situation wasn't lost on the neighbors who had begun to gather. Eleanor from across the street was already recording with her phone while Tom from next door stood in his bathrobe, coffee mug in hand, wearing an expression that suggested this was better than any morning show. "Deborah," Marcus said slowly, "you're the president of the HOA, not a landscaper or a truck driver. Why are you even driving that thing?" "My husband works for Patterson Logistics," she replied as if it explained everything. "I borrowed it to deliver some furniture to my daughter's new apartment later today." Without a commercial license, Marcus could feel his blood pressure rising. "That's hardly relevant to the violation at hand," Deborah sniffed, flipping through pages on her clipboard. "Now about your garbage cans, they were visible from the street last Thursday." The police arrived before Marcus could respond, which was probably for the best. Officer Reynolds was a familiar face in the neighborhood, having responded to numerous HOA-related disputes over the years. "Morning, Marcus," the officer said, surveying the scene. "Mrs. Winters." His tone noticeably cooled at Deborah's name. "Want to explain why there's a semi in this man's yard?" "I was performing my duties as HOA president," Deborah began, but Officer Reynolds held up a hand. "Let me stop you right there. HOA presidents don't have authority to operate commercial vehicles without proper licensing, destroy private property, or trespass." He turned to Marcus. "You want to press charges?" Before Marcus could answer, Deborah's phone rang. She answered it, and her face visibly paled. "Yes, this is she," she said, her voice suddenly small. "Yes, I understand. No, I didn't realize, of course." She hung up and faced Marcus with a completely different demeanor. "That was the HOA's attorney. Apparently, your tree was actually on the approved list from last month's meeting." She swallowed hard. "And my husband just discovered I took the truck." Officer Reynolds couldn't suppress his smile. "Well, Mrs. Winters, it seems like you've got some explaining to do. Let's start with operating a commercial vehicle without a license." For the first time in the 5 years Marcus had lived in Oak Ridge Estates, Deborah Winters was speechless. And somehow that made the destruction of his beloved maple tree almost worth it. Almost. The news of Deborah's semi-truck disaster spread through Oak Ridge Estates faster than the neighborhood's premium fiber internet. By afternoon, Marcus had received 17 text messages, 4 casserole deliveries, and 1 fruit basket from neighbors expressing equal parts sympathy and barely concealed delight at Deborah's downfall. "She cited me last month for wind chimes," said Brenda from 2 streets over, who had arrived with a blueberry cobbler and a thirst for details. "Said they constituted noise pollution even though they were bamboo and barely made a sound." Marcus sat on his porch watching the tow company struggle to extract the semi from his yard without causing further damage. The remains of his Japanese maple lay in a sad pile by the curb. His phone buzzed with a notification from the neighborhood app. Someone had already created a group called Survivors of Deborah that had gained 57 members in 2 hours. "You know she's not going to let this go," Tom warned, leaning against the porch railing. "This is just the beginning." "What else can she possibly do?" Marcus asked. "She drove a truck into my yard. The police have her license." The HOA attorney called her directly. Tom took a sip of his ever-present coffee. "You don't understand how she operates. Last year, when the Martinez family painted their door that slightly off-approved shade of blue, she campaigned for 3 months to have them repainted. Created a whole color committee just to retroactively make their shade non-compliant." Marcus's phone rang, an unknown number. "Mr. Thompson, this is Garrett Williams, attorney for Oak Ridge Estates HOA." The voice was smooth, practiced. "I wanted to reach out personally about this morning's incident." "You mean when your HOA president crashed a commercial vehicle into my yard while illegally enforcing a non-existent violation?" There was a pause. "Yes, that's an accurate assessment." The board would like to offer immediate compensation for your tree and landscaping damage. And, Marcus prompted, and Mrs. Winters has been asked to temporarily step down from her position pending a special meeting next week. Marcus watched as the tow truck finally freed the semi, leaving deep tracks across what remained of his lawn. That's it. She committed multiple crimes. The board feels. The board always protects her. Marcus interrupted. This isn't her first overreach, just her most dramatic one. After ending the call with vague promises of further discussion, Marcus noticed a text from Eleanor. Asterisk, check your email. You need to see what she just sent to the whole neighborhood asterisk. The email had arrived 4 minutes ago with the subject line, urgent, safety hazards and neighborhood vigilance. Asterisk, dear Oak Ridge community members, asterisk, it began. Asterisk, in light of this morning's unfortunate traffic incident, I feel compelled to address the growing safety concerns in our prestigious neighborhood. While performing my duties as your elected HOA president, I discovered several hazardous conditions that require immediate attention, asterisk. Asterisk, effective immediately, I am implementing emergency measures to inspect all front-facing trees regardless of previous approvals. The incident at the Thompson residence demonstrates how even approved landscaping can create dangerous conditions, asterisk. Marcus couldn't believe what he was reading. Somehow, Deborah had transformed her reckless driving into a crusade for safety. The email continued with 6 new emergency protocols that essentially gave her authority to enter properties for safety inspections. His doorbell rang again. This time it was Officer Reynolds, no longer in uniform. Thought you should know, he said without preamble. Deborah's husband just pulled some strings with the judge. Her reckless driving charge got reduced to a minor infraction, and she's already spinning this as her heroically avoiding a child that ran into the street. There was no child, Marcus said flatly. I know that, and you know that. Reynolds shrugged. But that's her story now, and half the neighborhood's already buying it. The emergency HOA meeting was scheduled for Thursday evening in the community clubhouse. Marcus arrived 15 minutes early to find the parking lot already full and a crowd gathering outside. Inside, the usually half-empty room was packed, with neighbors standing against walls and spilling into the hallway. I've never seen this many people at an HOA meeting, whispered Eleanor, squeezing into the chair next to Marcus. Even when they tried to ban garden gnomes, we only got 20 people. Marcus nodded, scanning the room. Deborah was nowhere to be seen, but her loyal committee members occupied the front row, all dressed in variations of business casual as if attending a corporate board meeting instead of a neighborhood dispute. At precisely 7:00 p.m., the side door opened and Deborah walked in. She'd undergone what Marcus could only describe as a tactical makeover, her usual sharp blazer replaced by a softer cardigan, her severe bun loosened to gentle waves, and she wore minimal makeup that somehow made her appear both vulnerable and determined. Thank you all for coming, she began, her voice slightly tremulous. I'm touched by this display of community concern after my frightening ordeal. A murmur ran through the crowd. Marcus exchanged glances with Eleanor, who rolled her eyes dramatically. For those who haven't heard the full story, Deborah continued, I was conducting a routine safety inspection when a child darted into the street on a scooter. I had to make a split-second decision to avoid tragedy, resulting in damage to my vehicle and, unfortunately, Mr. Thompson's landscaping. That's not what happened. Marcus stood up, unable to contain himself. There was no child. You admitted you were delivering violation notices and claim you swerved for a cat, not a child. Deborah's expression shifted momentarily before settling back into practiced sympathy. I understand you're upset about your tree, Marcus. Trauma affects memory, and from your bedroom window, you couldn't have had a clear view of the street. I have it on video, called out a voice from the back. All heads turned to see Mrs. Kapoor, the quiet widow from the corner house, standing with her tablet. My security camera caught the whole thing. There was no child, no cat. The truck didn't swerve, it drove straight into Marcus's yard while Ms. Winters was looking down at something in her lap. The room erupted in chatter. Deborah's face tightened as she tapped her gavel for order. That's enough. Security footage can be misleading from certain angles. Besides, this meeting isn't about assigning blame for an accident. It's about implementing new safety measures to prevent future incidents. Marcus stood again. No, this meeting is happening because you used a commercial vehicle without a license to trespass on my property, destroyed my landscaping, lied to a police officer, and are now trying to use this incident to grant yourself even more power over our neighborhood. Applause broke out, surprising both Marcus and Deborah. The vice president of the HOA, a retired attorney named Walter Green, cleared his throat and approached the microphone. I move that we table all discussion of new safety protocols until we've resolved the incident at hand, he said firmly. And I further move that we vote on whether Mrs. Winters should continue as HOA president given the circumstances. Deborah's carefully constructed composure cracked. You can't do that. The bylaws clearly state that removal of an officer requires written notice 14 days in advance. Walter smiled thinly. Actually, Section 5, Paragraph C allows for emergency removal in cases of conduct unbecoming an officer with a 2/3 majority vote. I believe operating a commercial vehicle without a license, trespassing, property destruction, and falsifying reports to law enforcement qualify. This is absurd. Deborah's voice rose sharply. I've dedicated 5 years to keeping this neighborhood pristine. Your property values have increased 12% under my leadership. All in favor of removing Deborah Winters as HOA president effective immediately? Walter asked, ignoring her outburst. Hands shot up across the room. Walter made a show of counting slowly. The motion passes 78-12. Deborah stared in disbelief as Walter gently removed the gavel from her hand. This isn't over, she hissed, gathering her belongings. You have no idea what you've just done. As she stormed out, the room burst into spontaneous applause. Several people approached Marcus with handshakes and backpats. For a moment, it felt like victory. Don't celebrate yet, Tom murmured as the crowd dispersed. She's got friends on the city council and the planning commission. And she knows every violation in every house in this neighborhood. This is just getting started. The week following Deborah's removal passed in unexpected tranquility. Marcus received a check from the HOA insurance covering the full value of his Japanese maple plus landscaping restoration. Walter, the new interim president, personally delivered it along with a handwritten apology from the board. I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop, Marcus admitted to Eleanor as they sat on his newly cleared front yard, watching the landscapers prepare the ground for a replacement tree. It's been too quiet. Eleanor nodded, scrolling through her phone. Deborah hasn't posted anything in the neighborhood groups all week. No one's seen her car leave the garage. It's like she vanished. Maybe she's finally accepted defeat, Marcus suggested, though he didn't believe it himself. The answer came the following morning in the form of certified letters delivered to 17 houses in Oak Ridge Estates, including Marcus's. The return address was Winters and Associates, attorneys at law. Marcus tore open the envelope to find a formal legal notice informing him that he was being sued personally for defamation, harassment, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The letter claimed he had orchestrated a malicious campaign to damage Mrs. Winters' reputation through false accusations and manipulation of community sentiment. His phone began ringing immediately. Tom was first. Did you get one too? She's suing me for providing a platform for defamatory statements because people talked in my front yard. By noon, all 17 recipients of the letters had created a group chat. The lawsuit amounts totaled over $2 million collectively, with Marcus facing the highest individual claim at $350,000. Her husband's cousin is a personal injury attorney in the city, explained Walter during an emergency meeting in Marcus's living room. He's taken the case on contingency, probably assuming we'll settle quietly to avoid the hassle. Can she actually win this? Asked Mrs. Kapoor, who was being sued for $75,000 for sharing her security footage. Walter sighed. It's not about winning. It's about dragging us through an expensive legal process until we give up. Even if we prevail, legal fees could bankrupt some of us. So what do we do? Eleanor asked. She was being sued for creating the Survivors of Deborah group. We could countersue, suggested Tom, for the damage to Marcus' property for emotional distress of her own making. The doorbell rang, interrupting their strategy session. A courier delivered another certified letter, this one addressed to the residents of Oak Ridge Estates. Inside was a proposal from Deborah. She would drop all lawsuits in exchange for reinstatement as HOA president, a formal apology published in the community newsletter, and the creation of a neighborhood safety and compliance fund with an initial contribution of $50,000 from HOA reserves. She was holding the neighborhood hostage, Marcus said in disbelief, and using our own HOA dues to do it, added Walter. The fund would give her unrestricted authority to hire compliance consultants, probably relatives who would rubber stamp whatever she wants. The doorbell rang again. This time it was Officer Reynolds, now joined by a man in an expensive suit who introduced himself as Stephen Wright from the district attorney's office. We've been monitoring the situation, Officer Reynolds explained once they were seated. Mrs. Winters has crossed some lines that go beyond civil disputes. Mr. Wright nodded. Filing frivolous lawsuits as intimidation falls under harassment statutes, and we've been looking into some financial irregularities with the HOA accounts during Mrs. Winters' tenure. Financial irregularities? Walter repeated. What kind? The kind where community landscaping contracts mysteriously went to her brother-in-law's company at twice the market rate, Officer Reynolds said. The kind where administrative expenses increased 300%, but no one can find receipts. Mr. Wright handed Marcus his card. We're building a case. These lawsuit threats give us additional grounds for witness intimidation charges. If everyone's willing to provide statements, we can move forward with formal charges. As the officials departed, Marcus stared at the business card in his hand and at the lawsuit notice on his coffee table. The group sat in silence, weighing their options. "She's betting we won't fight back," Eleanor finally said. "That will fold to avoid the hassle and expense." Marcus looked around at his neighbors, people he'd barely known a week ago who were now united in his living room. Then she bet wrong. The morning of the court hearing arrived with an unexpected twist. As Marcus stepped outside to retrieve his newspaper, he found his driveway blocked by a white van from Channel 7 News. A reporter with perfect hair and a microphone approached him before he could retreat inside. "Mr. Thompson, Alicia Chen from Channel 7. We understand you're at the center of a neighborhood dispute that's escalated to criminal charges. Do you have any comment on allegations that this is a vendetta against Mrs. Winters for enforcing HOA regulations?" Marcus blinked in confusion. "What? No, that's not." Sources close to Mrs. Winters claim she's being targeted for maintaining property values and standards in the community, the reporter continued, thrusting the microphone closer. "How do you respond to accusations that this is really about residents wanting to bypass community regulations?" Before Marcus could answer, Eleanor appeared beside him, coffee mug in hand, but eyes sharp and focused. "That's a creative interpretation," she said smoothly. "But perhaps you should ask why Mrs. Winters operated a commercial vehicle without a license, destroyed private property, filed false police reports, and is now using frivolous lawsuits to intimidate neighbors who have video evidence of her actions." The reporter's interest visibly shifted. "Video evidence?" "Mrs. Kapoor's security camera captured the entire incident," Eleanor continued. "And the DA's office is investigating financial irregularities in HOA contracts awarded during Mrs. Winters' tenure. But you already knew that part, didn't you? Since public records show those contracts went to companies owned by her relatives, including her husband's construction firm, which coincidentally employs the brother of your station manager." The camera operator lowered his equipment slightly. The reporter's smile faltered. "We have copies of all relevant documents," Eleanor added pleasantly. "I'd be happy to provide them." "Along with the security footage, of course." The news van departed 15 minutes later. Marcus stared at Eleanor in amazement. "How did you know all that about the station manager?" Eleanor shrugged. "I didn't for certain. But Deborah's been bragging about her media connections for years. I figured there had to be something there." She sipped her coffee. "Also, I worked in PR for 20 years before retiring. Always strike first with the press." At the courthouse, they found their neighbors already gathered in the lobby. Walter was distributing folders containing financial records and timelines of events. Deborah's attorney requested a continuance, he informed the group. "Apparently, they weren't expecting us to bring counter evidence. They wanted more time to prepare." "Did they get it?" Marcus asked. "No. Judge Myers denied it. Said this was a preliminary hearing, not a trial, and all parties had adequate notice." Walter smiled slightly. "Fun fact, Judge Myers lives in Riverside Meadows. Their HOA had a run-in with Deborah 3 years ago when she tried to get their board to adopt her model bylaws." As they filed into the courtroom, Marcus spotted Deborah sitting with her attorney. Gone was the soft cardigan and gentle waves. She reverted to her power blazer and tight bun, her expression stone cold as she whispered intensely to her lawyer. The proceedings began with the district attorney outlining the case. Financial records flashed on screen showing suspicious contracts, inflated invoices, and questionable bank transfers. Security footage played showing the truck incident from multiple angles, clearly contradicting Deborah's various accounts. When Deborah's attorney finally rose to speak, his approach had visibly shifted from aggressive to damage control. "Your Honor, while we dispute some characterizations of these events, my client is prepared to withdraw all civil actions against the residents of Oak Ridge Estates as a good-faith gesture toward resolving this unfortunate situation." Judge Myers peered over her glasses. "And the criminal charges, Mr. Patterson? Those aren't Mrs. Winters to withdraw. We're hoping the district attorney might consider." "We're not offering a deal at this time, Your Honor," the DA interrupted. "The evidence of financial impropriety alone warrants prosecution." Deborah's composure finally cracked. She stood abruptly, ignoring her attorney's attempt to pull her back down. "This is persecution," she exclaimed. "Everything I did was for the good of the community. Do they think property values maintain themselves? Do they think order happens without enforcement? I've sacrificed countless hours." "Mrs. Winters," Judge Myers cut in sharply. "This outburst isn't helping your case. Please sit down or I'll have you removed." The emergency HOA meeting that evening made the previous one look like a casual gathering. Not only was every homeowner present, but several had brought attorneys. The tension in the room was palpable as Deborah stood at the podium, flanked by her 3 most loyal committee members, her husband lurking near the door with his arms crossed. "The purpose of this meeting," Deborah began, her voice steady and practiced, is to approve the establishment of a legal defense fund to protect board members acting in good faith on behalf of our community. Recent events have made it clear that serving on this board carries unexpected risks. Walter rose immediately. Point of order. Mrs. Winters is no longer president of this board and has no authority to call a meeting or introduce motions. Deborah smiled thinly. The meeting was called by Acting Vice President Raymond Henderson, who remains in his position. She gestured to a nervous-looking man to her right. The bylaws are quite clear that any board member may call an emergency meeting with 24 hours' notice. The notice was sent at 11:58 p.m. last night, Eleanor pointed out. That's technically 23 hours and 2 minutes. I'm sure the court would consider that substantial compliance, Deborah replied dismissively. Now regarding the motion. I have a question. Marcus interrupted, standing. How much money are you requesting for this defense fund and who exactly would qualify to access it? The initial allocation would be $75,000. Raymond answered shakily, clearly reading from notes Deborah had prepared. Available to any board member, past or present, facing legal action related to their HOA duties. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Marcus remained standing. So to be clear, this is a fund created specifically to pay your legal bills after you crash a truck into my yard, filed false police reports, and allegedly misappropriated HOA funds. That characterization is precisely why this fund is necessary, Deborah snapped. These baseless accusations are supported by evidence the DA's office found compelling enough to pursue criminal charges. Walter finished for her. Deborah's husband stepped forward. My wife has dedicated 5 years to keeping this neighborhood from turning into a trash heap like Meadowbrook Estates. Their property values dropped 12% last year after they started allowing visible basketball hoops and non-regulation mailboxes. Speaking of property values, called out Tom from the back, mine dropped considerably when a semi-truck crashed across the street. And again when I got served with a frivolous lawsuit. Mrs. Kapoor stood. I move that we conduct an independent audit of all HOA finances for the past 5 years before considering any new allocations. I second that motion, said at least a dozen voices simultaneously. That motion is out of order, Deborah declared. We're here to discuss the defense fund proposal only. From the back of the room came a new voice. Actually, any motion made and seconded must be voted on according to Robert's Rules of Order, which your own bylaws adopt as parliamentary procedure. All heads turned to see a tall woman in a tailored suit standing by the door. Jessica Chen, she introduced herself. I'm a real estate attorney representing several homeowners here, and I've reviewed your bylaws quite thoroughly. Deborah's face flushed. This is a closed meeting for residents only. I live at 42 Oak Ridge Lane, Jessica replied smoothly. Purchased 3 months ago. You approved my exterior paint colors yourself, Mrs. Winters. The room erupted in barely suppressed laughter. Deborah gripped the edges of the podium. Furthermore, Jessica continued, I've discovered some concerning irregularities in the HOA's corporate filings. It appears the annual reports haven't been properly submitted for the past 2 years, which means the HOA's corporate shield could be compromised, potentially exposing board members to personal liability. Raymond, still at Deborah's side, visibly paled. Personal liability? But you said. He turned to Deborah, then stopped abruptly. Said what? Walter prompted. That we were completely protected as board members, Raymond finished, stepping away from Deborah. That we could never be personally sued for HOA decisions. Jessica shook her head. That's incorrect. Board members are protected only when acting in good faith and within the scope of their authority, and only if the HOA maintains its corporate status in good standing. Deborah's remaining supporters exchanged worried glances. One by one, they moved away. The independent audit took 3 weeks. During that time, Oak Ridge Estates experienced an eerie calm. Deborah's house stood quiet, curtains drawn, her usual morning power walks conspicuously absent. Her car appeared only for her attorney appointments and disappeared immediately afterward. It's like living next to a haunted house, Tom remarked to Marcus as they helped install Mrs. Kapoor's new security cameras. I keep expecting something to happen. Something did happen, but not what anyone expected. On a Tuesday morning, moving trucks appeared in Deborah's driveway. By afternoon, whispers spread through the neighborhood group chat. She's leaving? Eleanor texted with multiple question marks. Marcus watched from his home office window as professional movers loaded furniture into the truck. Deborah supervised with clipboard in hand, directing every movement with the same precision she'd once applied to HOA violations. Before he could process this development, his phone rang. It was Walter, his voice tight with urgency. Emergency meeting. Right now. The auditor just submitted his preliminary report. 20 minutes later, Marcus joined a hastily assembled group in Walter's dining room. Jessica Chen, the attorney neighbor, was already there reviewing documents with a grave expression. An older man in a rumpled suit stood at the head of the table, presumably the auditor. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," Walter began. "This is Nelson Adams from Financial Integrity Partners. He's been conducting our audit." Mr. Adams adjusted his glasses. "I've been a forensic accountant for 32 years, he said without preamble. "What I found in your HOA finances is unusual, to say the least." He placed a stack of documents on the table. "Over the past 4 years, approximately $420,000 has been diverted from your HOA reserves through a sophisticated scheme involving inflated vendor contracts, phantom maintenance projects, and administrative consulting fees paid to shell companies." Eleanor gasped. "That's nearly half our reserve fund." "The money trail leads to multiple LLCs," Mr. Adams continued, "all ultimately controlled by Deborah and Gerald Winters, though carefully obscured through various family members and associates." "Is that why she's moving?" Marcus asked. "She knows she's caught." Jessica shook her head. "It's more complicated than that. I received a notice this morning that Oak Ridge Estates is being sued by Winters Development Group for breach of contract." "Winters Development Group?" Tom repeated. "As in Deborah's husband's company?" "The very same," Jessica confirmed. "They're claiming the HOA owes them $1.2 million for landscaping and infrastructure maintenance contracts that were improperly terminated after Mrs. Winters' removal from the board." Walter rubbed his temples. "These contracts weren't even legitimate to begin with. How can they sue us?" "Because they know we can't afford to fight it," Jessica explained. "Even with clear evidence of fraud, legal proceedings could take years and drain whatever reserves we have left. They're betting we'll settle. Meanwhile, they're moving to Arizona," added Mr. Adams, "where homestead laws will protect their primary residents from judgments." The room fell silent as the magnitude of the situation sank in. "So they steal our money, sue us for more, then leave town with no consequences?" Mrs. Kapoor asked quietly. "Not necessarily," came a new voice from the doorway. Officer Reynolds stood there with Mr. Wright from the DA's office and another man in a dark suit. "Special Agent Tanner, FBI," the newcomer introduced himself. "We've been monitoring this situation since the financial irregularities were reported. What you've uncovered isn't just HOA fraud. It's part of a pattern the Winters have executed in 3 other communities across 2 states." The agent laid out a series of photos showing Deborah and her husband at different properties over the years. They move into upscale neighborhoods, gain control of the HOA, divert funds through fraudulent contracts, then manufacture a crisis that allows them to cash out and move on before anyone realizes what happened. "We've been building a federal case for wire fraud and interstate financial crimes," Mr. Wright added. "The audit findings are exactly what we needed to secure warrants."